Good day, everyone. Our program will begin in just a moment. Hello, everyone. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day and welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, Israel at War, a series featuring weekly programs surrounding the evolving situation in Israel and Gaza, understanding its impact around the world, and sharing action items that you can take from wherever you are. Today's program is co-sponsored by Visions of Abraham, a nonprofit organization under the leadership of Eli Epstein, dedicated to creating a deeper understanding of the Abraham Accords through dialogue and interaction between American Jewish community leaders in the Abraham Accord countries. We are delighted to be joined today by the Honorable Jason Greenblatt, a diplomat, lawyer, and author of In the Path of Abraham, who served as an assistant to the president and the White House special envoy to the Middle East in the Trump administration. In this role, Greenblatt served as one of the chief architects of the Peace to Prosperity Plan between Israel and the Palestinians, and was one of the key players in laying the foundation for the Abraham Accords. Greenblatt, in conversation with AJC Chief Policy and Political Affairs Officer Jason Isaacson, will discuss the recent tensions in the Arab world since October 7th and what that means for the future of the Abraham Accords and peace in the region. After we hear from our guests, time permitting, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org. That's questions plural, or you can use the Q&A feature in Zoom. Jason Isaacson, I turn the floor over to you.
Daniel, thank you very much. As Daniel just described, as a longtime advisor to Donald Trump and the president's special representative for international negotiations, Jason Greenblatt did play a central role in the administration's policies toward Israel, the Palestinians, and the broader Middle East, policies that set the stage for the historic Abraham Accords of 2020. In response to the October 7th massacre by Hamas terrorists in Israeli communities bordering Gaza, the firing of thousands of missiles from Gaza into Israel, and the kidnapping of some 240 Israelis and foreign nationals, not only has Israel acted forcefully to put an end to the intolerable Hamas threat and free the hostages, but the entire region has been inflamed with a torrent of government denunciations of Israel's self-defensive actions and widespread street demonstrations against relations with Israel and against the very existence of Israel. And it's against this background that the American Jewish Committee and our partners in Visions of Abraham wish to spend this hour gaining Jason Greenblatt's perspective on the current crisis and its ramifications. And I do want to, as Daniel Silver just mentioned, take this opportunity to especially thank my longtime friend, Eli Epstein, the visionary behind Visions of Abraham, for making today's program possible. And I'll begin this session with a few questions, and then we will open the conversation to questions from viewers. I also want to refer viewers to Jason Greenblatt's 2022 book, In the Path of Abraham, which is available on Amazon, and also encourage viewers to follow him on X at GreenblattJD, and on Instagram at jason.greenblatt. Now, before we begin, Jason, thank you for joining us for this important discussion.
Thank you, Jason. I remember many of our conversations while I worked in the White House. Thank you for all you do. Thank you for all AJC does. Thank you, Eli and Visions of Abraham, for allowing today to happen.
So let's dive in. Jason, I'm eager to get your read on the regional impact of the October 7th atrocities and Israel's response. But first, I just need to ask you, as someone deeply committed to the security and well-being of Israel, and as a former presidential advisor on Israel, how you learned about the nightmare of October 7th, what your initial thoughts were, and how you would assess both the Israeli and the U.S. responses to date.
So I learned about it in synagogue. I was surprised. Somebody came up to me. I was actually at a small minyan that morning, and somebody came up to me and said he had heard from somebody, I don't know who, about paragliders that had infiltrated Israel. Nobody had any details that morning, but as the day wore on, and certainly by the time of Mincha afternoon prayers, a lot more information came out. Though the truth is that really until after the holiday and even into the weeks that followed, I don't think I really comprehended the atrocities that Hamas perpetrated upon the Israelis. Look, even over the last couple of weeks, the Israelis have been showing this documentary film of everything, and people are just unbelievably shocked. It gets worse and worse and worse the more information people get. The response of, I'll start with Israel, the response of the Israeli government, I think is what they need to do, right? I know it pains people. I know the images on television are terrible. I know the media coverage, largely speaking, is starting to turn in a way against Israel. I feel for innocent Palestinians who are caught up in this war. But at the end of the day, Israel has no choice but to do this or face more October 7th. And let's remember, Hamas has made no secret of its intentions. It's in its charter. We know that. We all know that it intends to destroy Israel. But to have somebody go on TV and tell a newscaster that October 7 is just part one, now there'll be on October 7, 2, and 3, and 4, etc. I don't know what people expect out of Israel other than to do what it does. In terms of the U.S. response, and look, I was a Trump person, and I've been critical of President Biden until October 7 for different reasons, including how he treats some of our Arab allies in the Middle East. I think he has been extremely strong. I think he's been really a good friend to Israel. He sent many, many important signals, not only his visit, but sending the aircraft carriers. All the messaging throughout the administration, I think, has been complete. I don't want to say completely, but heavily on target. Whether it's a guy like John Kirby, who I've had my issues with on policy, who's actually cried from the White House when he's on live TV. Matt Miller, the State Department spokesman, who I don't know personally, has been very strong. President Biden himself, of course. Are there issues that I have? Sure. I think he's making a mistake with Iran. I think what he's trying to do and still kind of keep Iran close is a problem. I think him talking about peace with the Palestinians and the two-state solution now is a mistake. There are certainly things that I could say I would advise him differently on, but overall, I think he's been doing a great job.
Thank you for that. We'll get, I think, more into the American side of this equation a little later on in our conversation. But let me talk about last weekend, the joint Organization of Islamic Cooperation and Arab League summit that took place in Riyadh. At that summit, Israel's actions, of course, were universally condemned, but the resolution that was adopted by the group really fell short of calling for specific sanctions or for the suspension of diplomatic ties and other exchanges with Israel. Were you surprised by this reaction from the leaders of Arab and Muslim majority nations?
What I tell anyone I speak to, it's really important when you see these reactions, you need to take off your Israel hat. We're obviously all Israel supporters. And we obviously were disappointed not only over the weekend, but at the very beginning when some of these statements came out, whether from Saudi Arabia or Qatar, the UAE statement was actually reasonably good. And Saudi Arabia and Qatar morphed their statements as more information came out, though far from perfect in my view. But it's important to understand, whether it was at the beginning or over the weekend, you have to look at it through their eyes. Yes, these are governments that are monarchies, and in theory, they should be able to do what they want to do, but they can't. They're under tremendous pressure from their populations. They're under tremendous pressure from others. And as in any part of the world, politics and people's opinions play a very, very important role in how they handle these things. So I'm not surprised by the statement. I think it's unfortunate. I wish it could have been different. But as reporting has suggested, I haven't verified this myself, they definitely stopped short of sanctions and things like that, assuming the reporting is true. I think that sends a really, really important signal. So perhaps the best way I could answer it is, I think the Abraham Accords, while going under tremendous stress, and potential countries who might one day join the Abraham Accords are obviously not in the ballpark at the moment, I'm still hopeful that things will continue apace, and these countries, these leaders are doing what they need to do for their own country while still trying to go down a path of peace with Israel.
Let's dig into this a little bit further. In AJC's discussions since October 7th with officials across the region, and I should tell you that I'm speaking to you from the region, including discussions that we've had in person with officials in their capitals, we've come away with a sense that leaders understand the extremist enemies of Israel are very much their enemies, and that the elimination of Hamas will remove an obstacle to regional peace and also an obstacle to the fulfillment of Palestinian political aspirations. Yet as we're just describing, as you're just describing, for the most part, there is a reluctance to say in public what they're saying in private. And I wonder if you can help us understand that.
Yeah. So I believe I have not been in the region since October 7. I actually canceled a couple of trips. But I believe what you're saying is 100% accurate, especially because I'm getting it on this side as well, but not with the kind of officials I think you've been meeting with. I've not spoken to any of that level of officials since October 7. So this is what's inside my head. It's not any specific quote from any particular leader. They absolutely know that Hamas and Hamas's type is an enemy of the region. It's not only an enemy of Israel, it's not only an enemy, by the way, of the Palestinians, but it is terrible for the region. So is the Iranian regime. And they know that. But at the same time, they don't have the latitude that Israel does, or the need that Israel does at the moment anyway, to try to make it public or even act upon destroying Hamas and Hamas's type. They have to be extremely careful what they say in public. And that's totally understandable. Even in private, by the way, they do not sell out the Palestinians as some accuse them of doing. They absolutely support the Palestinian people. They obviously don't support Hamas, and they certainly are frustrated with the Palestinian Authority and President Abbas, but they try really hard to be practical and smart and careful with what they do publicly, because to do anything differently, I think, would create potential tension in the street. And maybe the best example I could give you is what happened with the hospital report from a couple of weeks ago, when the media immediately and obviously wrongfully declared that it was Israel who bombed that hospital, when it turned out it was an errant Palestinian Islamic Jihad missile. If you notice how quickly the flare-up of the public reaction was in Jordan, and it didn't happen in most of the other countries, but there were immediate flare-ups. It reminded me of when the US embassy was taken over in Iran back in 1979. And they need to be mindful of these things. And I think we need to give them the political space and respect to understand that they're doing the best they can to manage a bad situation for Israel, a bad situation for the Palestinians, and a potentially dangerous situation for themselves.
And talking about that incident of the hospital hit by an errant Palestinian Islamic Jihad missile, I remember after the truth came out about where that fire actually came from, it was pointed out to a foreign minister from a country in the Levant that it wasn't an Israeli missile strike. And yet there was this ferocious reaction in his country. And he basically said on cable news, it didn't matter whether the truth is that it's a PIJ missile. The people believe that it's an Israeli strike, and that's really what matters. It's a terrible reality that the region finds itself in, that it comes to that the truth doesn't even always matter.
100%, but worse, right? Even in America, the truth doesn't matter. If you look at what's happening on college campuses, I'm not sure if we're going to get to that, but those people who either don't want to believe or want to believe the worst about Israel, or Jews want to believe the best about Hamas, aren't going to listen to the truth. The people that matter, the important people, the leadership knows the difference. The intellectually honest people among the populations, they matter, and it also makes a big difference that they believe it. But there's a certain segment of society, whether it's in the Middle East or even here in America, and of course in Europe, that just don't care. They hate Israel, they hate Jews, and no matter what evidence you show them, they will always try to blame it upon Israel.
Let's talk for a minute about Palestinian political aspirations. When you were in the White House, you worked on the issue of Israeli-Palestinian peace, leading up to efforts by the administration to put forward a peace plan for the Palestinians. To state the obvious, Palestinian political aspirations haven't been a priority for the current Israeli government, especially with the coalition that is now governing Israel. But with Israeli-Palestinian trust, whatever degree of trust existed before October 7th, now so badly damaged in the wake of the October 7th massacre, and the Palestinian Authority's failure to condemn those attacks, and even Palestinian public support for Hamas that we have seen, do you see any prospect of this issue returning to the Israeli political agenda as the fighting in Gaza finally winds down?
So there were two aspects to the peace plan that we released under President Trump that I think must come to the forefront again. And both were borne out. One of them was Hamas must be eliminated, meaning it was a condition to our peace plan, which we called a realistic two-state solution. I don't like using the phrase two-state solution because it's such a thin title. Nobody has any idea what it means. We actually wrote a roughly 60-page political plan and a very big economic plan behind it that explained what we thought it meant. But one of those criteria was Hamas disarming and disappearing or turning into something else. Now, I never would have imagined what happened on October 7th. I did imagine, and I remind my kids that around March 30th of, I think it was 2019, maybe it was 2018, the Palestinians were sort of rushing the Gaza fence. And I always feared what would happen if they actually somehow managed to topple the fence or get through or something like that. And, you know, your imagination could go many places. Your imagination could go many places, but my imagination did not go to the atrocities and horrors of October 7th. The other issue besides Hamas disarming is the leadership, right? If Gaza has no credible leadership, and the leadership in Ramallah and whoever the Gaza leadership is going to be are bitter rivals, there's no sense in talking about a peace plan because you can't make peace when internally within the Palestinians there's such division. So the short answer, I guess, to your question is, if Israel is successful in rooting out Hamas, and if Israel or the world community manages to put in rational, reasonable, responsible leadership in Gaza, and if, whether it's President Abbas, who I don't think is a likely person to bring peace about, but if there's a successor leadership in Ramallah that's rational and reasonable and tries to negotiate in good faith, of course, yes. You know, as a former diplomat, you have to be optimistic. Otherwise, you would have a terrible life. So I'm always optimistic. But in the current circumstances, I'm not. And the last thing, because I think it's important, and people forget about this when they talk about the Palestinian Authority and the PLO taking over. Let's remember that although the Palestinian Authority was not responsible for October 7th, they have a law on their books where they pay Palestinians to murder or harm Israelis. The pay-to-slay law that we have here on our books, thanks to Lindsey Graham and people like Sandra Gerber and others who worked really hard to get that onto the United States law. But the pay-to-slay law that the Palestinians have, I should say, is a terrible thing. And that perpetuates this Jew hatred, this Israel hatred, this terrorism. So until things like that disappear, it's also going to be very difficult to go down the road of peace between Israel and the Palestinians.
What is your sense of the capacity and the desire of the responsible states in the region to help create a different reality for the Palestinians in Gaza and even in the West Bank?
I think the desire is strong, but the reality is probably not nearly anywhere where it should be or could be. I think each of them could play an important role. Less so Jordan. I think Jordan just has too many other challenges that the other countries around it have. But I've always said that if the Arab countries get together and work with Israel, it'll be so much easier to achieve an agreement with the Palestinians that could work for everybody and could not only work, but allow the Palestinians to usually succeed. If everybody takes a hands-off approach from the region, says Israel, you work it out, and if you work it out, great, and if you don't, okay, that is just going to make it all that much harder to do it. But if I were sitting in front of all of the leaders of the region once again, if I had that opportunity, I would explain to them that their hands being involved in the negotiations and the implementation, and certainly the backing of the Palestinians, both emotionally, obviously financially, but all sorts of backing, will enhance the possibility of achieving an agreement and the success of any agreement by 1,000 times than without it.
Let me turn to the situation within Israel itself. With AJC CEO Ted Deutsch and our president Michael Tickner and members of our executive council, I was in Israel last week on an AJC solidarity mission, and everywhere that we went, in every meeting, Israelis expressed gratitude for the huge outpouring of support for Israel in the Jewish diaspora, the generous gifts that have been given to help support the hundreds of thousands of Israelis displaced from their homes because of the attacks in the south and also in the north, in the face of missile and other attacks from Hezbollah terrorists in Lebanon. and the aid that has been provided to help families and the wounded rebuild their lives, and the political advocacy and public information efforts to focus attention on the necessity of freeing the hostages and putting the Hamas terror machine out of business. As we saw in yesterday's massive march in Washington, there is considerable unity in the Jewish diaspora community, in which it is often more common to focus on differences than on commonalities. Focusing, though, just on the United States, what is your sense of that unity, both within the diaspora in America and between Israeli and American Jews?
So the unity is just, it's beautiful and amazing and so important, right? And we can't let it fall out of our grasp again. Until October 7, sadly, I guess as has always been the case among Jews, there's been so much discord. I was at the rally yesterday. It was so meaningful, so special, so important. But to look around and, I don't know who's Jewish, who's not Jewish necessarily, because there were a lot of non-Jews there supporting Israel as well. In fact, funny enough, nobody told me about the blue bands, and I show up and I almost couldn't get in because I didn't have the blue bands. I was supposed to go with my synagogue. We decided to go the night ahead. And who gave me the bands? The Christians. It was very funny. So the support was tremendous. But if you look around, all ages, all persuasions of Jews, not a crossword other than the Neturei Karta Hasidic sect that were protesting outside. I think they were the only ones who were protesting outside, and shame on them, by the way. But the unity is there. I see the unity in the streets. I think everybody understands that we are in such terrible trouble if we don't unify, whether it's our kids on college campuses, things in the workplace. Everywhere we go, there are so many haters out there. So I'm proud of the unity. I hope we take it seriously and hold it dear and close to our hearts and keep it that way. The same is true, by the way, of the unity between Israel and America. For a long time, I heard when I was at the White House and even beyond that people were saying, look, Israel doesn't really need America anymore. They're great. They, the startup nation and all this amazing technology and this and that. In fact, it wasn't too long ago before October 7 that there were actually articles in the press about how it was time to wean Israel off US aid. And I think October 7 blew all of that out and said, all of this is wrong. The United States and Israel not only need each other, but Israel definitely needs the United States, whether it's under a President Trump or President Biden, whatever Congress it is, we can't let that relationship become politicized because Israel desperately needs it, no matter how talented they are. Look what happened on October 7. If Hezbollah opens up that front without US assistance, and I do believe President Biden sending the messages he had is holding off that threat. It doesn't mean that it will be held off, but it's holding off that threat. Israel absolutely needs America. I think Israel understands that. And I think that connection also needs to be held near and dear to our hearts. And we shouldn't let anybody try to break it, not from the right and not from the left.
Further to the question of unity, we're also seeing reports from Israel that thousands of the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox individuals who have been exempted from mandatory military service, have been volunteering for duty in the IDF. Does this suggest that internal divisions within Israel may be lessening in this period of national crisis? Do you see that phenomenon continuing after this crisis has passed?
So there too, I think, of course, at the moment, it's a beautiful thing to see the Haredim signing up in many, many numbers. And I think the support from the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi community, has also been really special to watch and see. I think, I didn't verify this yet, but I even heard, for example, that the Satmar Rebbe condemned the Neturei Karta for their messages, not from yesterday, but from over the weekend. I hope that's true. Again, though, the problem is what happens after the war? Will we see that same unity, or will we devolve into the ugliness of politics and all sorts of problems that cause that disunity and I'll use the word dislike, potentially hatred. And I think it's so important for leaders, for all leaders, whether it's AJC leadership, every Jewish organization out there from left to right, religious, non-religious, you name it, both here and in Israel, to remind ourselves how vulnerable Israel is and was on October 7 and since, to remind ourselves how vulnerable Jews are around the world, especially in America, but really all over the world, and realize we have to figure out a way to get to our differences respectfully. Just add one more thing, the same thing that I'm saying about the Jewish community and the Israel-America relationship is true about America, right? We're a deeply divided nation. bitterly, bitterly divided nation. Irrespective of Israel, our country has to figure out a way to work together to stop the petty politics. Fine, we'll have contests over who's going to win what seat in Congress, who's going to win the Oval Office. Of course, I get that. But at the same time, we're a nation like no other in the world, and I think we've let ourselves devolve into something so divided, and we have to work on that as well.
Well, that really feeds right into the question that I was going to ask next, and you've referred to this earlier in our conversation as well. Closer to home, turning to the political front, you have been critical, as have we, of voices on the extremes of the political spectrum, but particularly on the far left, who have mischaracterized and have slandered Israel and have given comfort and support to terrorists who seek the destruction of the one and only Jewish state. Yet, for the most part, you can see that there are still substantial bipartisan majorities in Congress supportive of Israel, and you've said that that's essential. You're a proud and influential partisan, I know, but do you share AJC's view that it's important to maintain that bipartisan support? How do we keep that bipartisan support for Israel, and how do we keep alive the understanding of Israel's necessary place in the national security, national interests of the United States?
Yeah, look, I've gotten heat for praising President Biden on every TV interview. And I think the answer is you have to be honest.
I'm sorry to add to your trouble.
No, I say what I mean, and I mean what I say. When I was in the Trump administration, it actually bothered me that there were some organizations, not yours, but there were some Jewish and pro-Israel organizations that disliked or even hated President Trump so much they wouldn't acknowledge the many accomplishments he did when it came to Israel and the Jewish community. And we could debate about his tweets, we could debate about his personality. I get all that. But at the end of the day, you have to call balls and strikes, and you have to do it respectfully, and you have to do it honestly. And I try to do that every day, and that's why I have no problem. I'm not at all ashamed of praising President Biden and his administration. I'll be critical where I think there needs to be criticism, as I alluded to earlier on the conversation. But where he's doing a strong and great job, it doesn't matter to me that he's a Democrat. And if we don't do it that way, and if we don't show hakarat hatov, gratitude for what people do, regardless of what party they're in, we're hurting our country, the United States, we're hurting Israel, we're hurting the potential for Jews to be protected in America. We just have to go beyond politics. And I think that most people who aren't, strong political activists, and I'm not a political activist myself, I think they recognize that. And the question is, can we encourage them to speak out to make sure that Israel and the Jewish community don't become political footballs?
Before I turn it over to questions from the audience, I want to come back to what we started this conversation talking about, which was, frankly, referring to your role in laying the foundation for the Abraham Accords. You've written about that in your book. Look ahead, and how far do you have to look ahead to see a return to the process that initiated on your watch 3 years ago of widening the circle of Arab-Israeli peace? How do we get past the current crisis and get back on that track that you put us on?
So I think while the media images are what they are, it's going to be very, very hard. I think Israel is going to have to hopefully make a success of its mission. We all hope that it'll be quick. By all accounts, it seems it will not be quick. It's just too difficult to do when Hamas is so embedded within the civilian population and civilian infrastructure. But at the moment, I think all we could do is try to keep those who have signed the Abraham Accords near and dear to our hearts. And by the way, I think it's so important. I know you're traveling right now, and I think being there and showing them gratitude and trying to explain to them how we deeply appreciate what they did. We can't forget whether it's the UAE or Bahrain or Morocco, of course. They took a tremendous risk and chance. Is it good for them? Sure, the Abraham Accords good for them too. But there's a lot of tension right now for these countries, and we have to show our gratitude, be with them, stand with them, and encourage them to get through this and hopefully deepen the relationship once this immediate crisis is over. Pile two, of course, is a country like Saudi Arabia. Who knows whether or not President Biden would have achieved it. There was a lot of talk about it. There were some big, big challenges. Saudi Arabia was making certain demands of the United States, which of course made sense for Saudi Arabia. Whether President Biden could have delivered, whether Congress was willing to give President Biden what he needed, I'm not sure. But they certainly made sense for Saudi Arabia, and whether the Israeli government would be able to deliver for Saudi Arabia, what they were asking for from the Palestinians. Big questions that nobody really had any answers to because they were either being discussed behind closed doors, as we did, or they just weren't ready to answer. But I think once this war is over, we should pick up those pieces very rapidly and try to work on that, because I think there's a lot of potential. And then there are countries that weren't in the news yet about being, let's call it, close to, although that's a big statement. The Saudi was not close to, as far as I know, but let's say on the track of a very complicated negotiation. And whether that is Qatar, I don't have any high hopes for Kuwait at the moment, but other countries in the region who understand the importance of Israel. They understand how everybody could be better off with Israel, but it's a different league, it's a different level, it's a different situation than Saudi Arabia. I think we need to work on that as well. Without constantly working on it respectfully, smartly, practically, explaining who the enemy is, because you have to, they know it, but you got to remind it again and again and again and show how everybody would be better off, including the Palestinians, by the way. It's very hard to get there. So maybe the best way I can answer it is to tell your listeners, because I know you do this all day, and I know the AJC staff does this all day, is we all need to be ambassadors to these countries and explain what we are trying to do, what Israel stands for, what Jews stands for, why everybody, the Arabs in the region, Israel, and including the Palestinians, will all be better off if we could create Abraham Accords 2.0 and 3.0 and 4.0. And let's remember, that's what we're all trying to create, while Hamas is trying to create October 7 2.0 and 3.0 and 4.0.
Well put. Thank you very much, Jason. And yes, we are committed. And yes, we've also heard from all sides of the equation that actually we were very close a month and a half ago to moving forward on that big prize of a relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and a stronger relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States. But we'll hope, and we will continue to exert every effort to move the entire region in that direction that you've just laid out. I think with that, Daniel, I'll ask if we could open it up to the audience.
Absolutely. We've got a lot of questions, so we'll try and get to as many as possible. Our first comes from Roger Benjamin. Jason, can you talk more about the role of Arab states in working with Palestinians and Israelis to put forward this political horizon? Do you think, for example, MBS could have a Sadat moment?
I do think he could have a Sadat moment. He's an extraordinarily talented leader. His country loves him. What he's doing for Saudi Arabia is remarkable. The question is whether I've always said, I would have said this to Bibi Netanyahu, I said it to President Trump, I would say it to President Biden. If you can get MBS in the room with Bibi Netanyahu or whoever the leader of Israel is at the time, you'll make a lot more progress than if you try to do shell diplomacy. Will MBS be able to do it again? Not at the moment. This is a forward-looking question. Will he be able to do it once this war is over? I think he could. I think he should. But it's not going to be so easy.
Our next question comes from Daniel Engel. How do you envision administration of the Gaza Strip after the war ends and Hamas hopefully is defeated? Do you envision Gazans returning back to their homes?
Well, I definitely think Gazans should return back. I think part of the challenge, and particularly for countries like Egypt, is the Palestinians and the Arabs view this potentially as another, what they call Nakba. It's not a word I would use, but they're claiming that Israel wants to reoccupy Gaza and kick Palestinians out from Gaza. I think there was some news yesterday about an Israeli minister here too. I didn't verify it, so don't quote me, making a comment that suggested Palestinians from Gaza should emigrate. Comments like that are not helpful to the problem. And I believe the last thing Israel wants is to reoccupy Gaza. The last thing Israel wants is to be responsible for the administration of Gaza. I think that it does need to be an international effort. I think having the Arab states work on it, both from a financial perspective, but also from an emotional and general support perspective, is far better than having Europeans or even Americans do it. Whether we contribute or not, I'll leave that up to Congress, who has the power of the purse. But I think having an having an Arab force, both from a security perspective and an administration perspective, working in concert with Israel, that's really, really important, will allow Gaza to rebuild, to heal, and hopefully to become something special, even in the absence of a potential peace deal with Israel. Because at the end of the day, Palestinians deserve better lives, especially Gazans who are now suffering tremendously because of Hamas. And there's no reason we can't give them better lives, even if a peace deal still remains out of reach.
Can I just also add, it's not only Palestinians in Gaza who will have to return to their homes and the rebuilding of their homes, but it's Israelis in southern Israel who will have to return. And there are tens of thousands who have been displaced by this and cannot return until, frankly, the Hamas terror machine is no longer.
100%.
Daniel?
This from Felice Goldman. Jason, do you think the Trump peace plan can be reworked as a helpful framework for a political horizon? How would you envision that working?
So I'm an interested party. So the answer is that yes, I think our peace plan really tried to describe in careful detail how it could work. I think what we did was great for Israel, even though, of course, we got criticized by certain elements of the right-wing society in Israel. For the most part, I think it was well received in Israel, but there were definitely criticisms also from the left, by the way, the extreme left. On the Palestinian side, I think what we created, even if people may have disagreed with how we handled Jerusalem and how we handled what I would call Judea and Samaria, others call the West Bank, and how we may have handled what some people call settlements, what I call cities, towns, and neighborhoods in Judea and Samaria. We could talk about that, and I certainly understand and have received a very fair share of criticism. But what could happen from that for the Palestinians is I firmly believe they could create something so unique and so special if they were to sign something like it, and even more so, whereas Israel had to struggle for every penny over the course of decades to create the huge success that it did, including having to defend itself from war after war, terror attack after terror attack. Here you're going to have the world, almost the entire world, jumping to throw money into whatever becomes of the Palestinian areas, whether you want to call it a state, a semi-state, an autonomous region. There's no point in getting into the words themselves because they're fraught with all sorts of conflict and meaning. But with the money that would be pumped into the Palestinian areas, they can probably fast track a successful, I don't know what to call it, a society, if you will, and they could tremendously benefit from it. And the question is, to really answer the question directly, whether someone will have the courage to pick up that peace plan once again and use that as the framework. I'd like to think that the next occupant of the Oval Office, whoever it will be, would think to do that and not just go back to the tired talking points of the past that never worked. But we have our own politics here in the United States too.
Thank you. Our next question from Amy Rogers. I understand the role of Arab governments, but can you talk about the role of the Arab populace on the region's ability to re-engage Israel on the issue of normalization? Is it possible to have renewed normalization if there is so much hatred? And just connected to that, Ray Termini was asking if, how do the rulers of those Arab countries who want normalization with Israel change the opinion of like the man on the Arab street who still might demonize Israel and the Jews?
So each country is different. It's very hard to paint them with a broad brush, but rather than go country by country, I'll try to paint them with a broad brush, despite my caution that you can't do that. I think that these countries have been making efforts to try to reduce and eventually eliminate that hatred. Some of them have made great strides. Certainly the United Arab Emirates has done that, although it's a much smaller country than, say, Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia has done a great job cleaning up their textbooks. So each of these countries needs to do that. Some have done a better job. Others have not done it at all. And I think it's an essential component to an eventual successful peace. Because, of course, you could have peace deals between leaders, but if the people are not behind it, it's not going to be a particularly successful deal for tourism and the economy and warm relationships. And we've seen that, for example, with Jordan, also with Egypt, but Jordan especially. So a lot more work has to be done on that part. Can it be done? Again, let's fast forward beyond the war, because I think until then, there's probably very little to discuss. Yeah, I think these leaders can step up to the plate and pick up the pieces from where they were, both under President Trump and then, of course, President Biden picking up the pieces for Saudi Arabia. I do think that I am optimistic that the time will come and the people will agree with their leaders that it's essential to enter into these kinds of deals.
And there's a media component of this equation as well. And it will be helpful if there is less media inflaming the situation and encouraging the fiercest reaction to what's happening in Gaza, as opposed to a media that more fairly reports what is actually happening and also what happened in Israel.
It's 100% true, and it's 100% true. Stations like Al Jazeera, for example, but let's not forget BBC, right? BBC doesn't do a great job. I'm not calling BBC Al Jazeera, but BBC has done a pretty lousy job, as opposed to, let's say, a group like CNN. I actually watch CNN. It might surprise some because I'm more on the right, I'm more conservative, but I do watch it. And I think for the most part, they have done CNN domestic, not international. I've heard not such great things about international. But the channel that I get here in New Jersey, I think has done quite a good job uncovering it. Are there things I could quibble with? Sure, the guests and guests who they give airtime to who lie about what's happening. Sure, there are definitely things that would change, but for the most part, they've done a good job. I don't think BBC has done a good job.
Thank you. We have many people on Zoom are asking a similar type of question about the role of youth in the region and in the Arab world. A huge portion of the region is under 40. How can they be included in efforts to maintain and expand peace in the region? And our country's doing a good job of bringing them into the conversation.
I think the countries are doing, again, pre-October 7 and then post when this war is over. We have to call a sort of a timeout during this tense and difficult and challenging period. I think the countries have started to do that job. I think a lot more needs to be done. And I'd love to see, for example, whether it's AJC and or other organizations engaging those youth. They're essential not only for public opinion, but they're essential for a successful peace deal. Again, we could sign a peace deal unless the population is behind it. It's not that successful. And given the youth bulge in most of these countries, we have to get these young people on side. I travel to the region a lot with my kids. My kids have engaged. These are kids aging from, my kids are ages 12 to 24, mostly on in their 20s. And they've engaged not only with the leaders, but also with the young population. And they realize on both sides, the population there and my kids, how much more alike we are than apart. We may disagree on Jerusalem and Israel and all that, and we do it respectfully. But the relationships that I've seen form are remarkable. And I'd love to see work, if it's possible, from AJC and others to try to engage and have those challenging conversations. We're not going to pretend for a second that they're all going to walk in and say, oh, thank you, Jason Isaacson, you've shown me the light, right? It doesn't work that way. But without the hard work of engaging and hearing and listening respectfully, it's going to be very hard to bring them on side.
Yeah, Jason, you'll be very pleased to hear that AJC has been doing this for a number of years, even beginning before the Abraham Accords, but especially since, bringing groups to the United States to celebrate the anniversaries of the Abraham Accords, groups of individuals from young people from the Abraham Accords countries, as well as bringing groups to Israel. And we will continue to do that more and more. We completely agree with what you've just said. The future of that region depends on the impressions formed in the minds of the young leaders. And we are finding emerging young leaders and discussing the realities and the possibilities, their aspirations for the Israeli-Palestinian peace, their aspirations for a broader peace across the region. And we are fully engaged in that project. So thank you for that endorsement.
Yeah, that's great. And if I could just add on top of it, I don't know if this is part of the questions, but look at the problem we have with the youth in our country, right? If you look at these prestigious, so-called prestigious universities, and you watch what's happening, it's outrageous. It's disgusting. How did we get here? We have to fix that.
Yeah, we have a lot of people who are focusing on that issue as well, Jason. Maybe that'll be our next conversation. Thank you.
Our next question is a combination of few. We're receiving several from our listeners about the hostages. We're now including a question that we received from Eric Goslin. We're now over 5 weeks into the war. 240 people are still being held hostage. Can you talk about Netanyahu's role in pushing for their safe return? I know people have noted in the chat, in other words, their frustration with Netanyahu on this issue, which is evidenced, I think, by planned marches in Israel coming up. What more needs to be done in Israel with the administration and around the world to bring these hostages home?
Boy, I don't envy Netanyahu. I mean, these are such complicated questions, right? In theory, he could offer a massive trade of Palestinians who are imprisoned because of terror or other reasons, um, ceasefire, temporary pause, long pause. These are all very, very difficult questions. Do you do this in order to bring the hostages home and potentially put other Israelis at risk, allow Hamas to rearm, allow Hamas to do all sorts of things? You know, it's very, there's a tension between bringing hostages home and Israel being successful in its war to protect all Israelis. Um, it is not as simple as people would think. And I'm sure that being discussed in Netanyahu's government are all sorts of possibilities. But at the end of the day, probably what takes priority over everything else is ensuring that they don't put the entire nation at risk. So I don't have any good answers for it. It's the most difficult thing from an emotional perspective. I said that the rally yesterday was beautiful and inspirational. The hardest thing, and it brought me to tears, were listening to the families of the hostages speak. You know, what can you say? You want every one of them home. I watched one of the fathers on CNN this morning who originally had said he was glad that his daughter had died, a young girl. I can't remember, maybe 9, 10 years old, because otherwise it would be too horrific. It turns out she may not be dead, and now he's talking about taking her home, taking her out of school for a year. Of course, like, how could your heart not go out to this father? But I don't have a good answer as to whether Netanyahu could be doing more or not. I'm not in the cabinet room. I don't know the intelligence that they're saying. I don't know what they're trying to do in terms of rescuing versus trading, what the risks are if they accede to the demands of a ceasefire versus or releasing Palestinian prisoners. So all I could say is I'd like to trust that they're doing everything they can, but at the same time, everything they can includes protecting all people in Israel, in addition to the hostages.
Thank you. Our next question from Solange Israel Mintz. Will it ever be possible for the United Nations to help in this situation and not be so biased as they've been? Or should efforts to improve the situation on the ground be shifted away from the UN? Perhaps there are other multinational organizations or agreements that could help calm the situation or secure regional security.
It's probably no secret that I'm anti-UN when it comes to Israel, and probably lots of other things. I think the UN has been atrocious for Israel. I think it continues to be atrocious for Israel. It's largely driven by political interests from different countries. The United States has much less power at the UN than we would think. I think Nikki Haley did a great job. I think the current ambassador is doing a really good job, but they're limited in terms of what they could do. I think one of our biggest failures, and this wasn't Nikki's fault, she tried valiantly, was to try to get Hamas known as a terror organization, and we couldn't do it. And I think even now, Linda Thomas Greenfield is trying to do that. I'm not sure if she'll succeed. Hopefully, because of October 7, she'll succeed. But I don't think the UN can play a positive role for Israel. I don't think they play a positive role for the Palestinians either, by the way. And I think these organizations are bloated, inefficient, waste a ton of money, and will not have Israel's interests, real interests at heart. Sorry to be so harsh, but I have some experience there.
Thank you. Our next question is from David Bardock. He's asking about the role that Qatar plays moving forward and how it assists with negotiations, but also as well as the funding of Hamas. How will this further complicate an already complex region?
So my take on Qatar is different than some people. I think we can debate all day long whether Qatar should continue what it's doing in terms of its relationship with Hamas on a going forward basis. But let's go backward. The US asked Qatar to have a Hamas office. Every dollar that went to, as far as I know, every dollar that went to Gaza during Trump's administration, and I believe under Biden's administration, was done not only in concert with the Israelis, but at the request of Israel. Israel wanted to keep the temperature down, which it largely did. Yes, there were rockets, and I don't want to make light of the handful of deaths that happened before October 7 from those rockets. But Israel's policy was, if we could get someone else to pay the bill there and keep the temperature down, because Israel needs every penny that it can for its own defense and the rest of its economy, that was a policy that they implemented, which we didn't want to second guess. And as far as I know, the Biden administration didn't second guess either. Now, we'll look back after the war when they do all their investigations to understand Was it a mistake among many other things that might have been a mistake or missed? And people may say it was a huge mistake, and that's fine, but it was the policy. I hope that Qatar can play a positive role moving forward. I think that the hostages who have been released, and God willing more, I think what would be the address if it wasn't Qatar to try to get those hostages out? The US doesn't talk to Hamas, even if they were willing to talk to Hamas. There's no reason that Hamas would talk to them or entertain them. So I think Qatar can and has played a positive role. I think it's a bit unfair for people to criticize them the way they have, but I do think we need to take a very strong approach in terms of how to deal with it moving forward after the war, and whether we can request and should request that they take those guys and parachute them into Gaza or the Iranian regime, well, probably not Gaza, or put them somewhere where they can't cause trouble. These are real serious conversations that ought to happen, but it's hard to do that at the moment.
Thank you. I have one final question. This one from Sarah Goldman. We're in an election, about to be in an election year, and curious of how you anticipate U.S. support to change as we enter an election year, regardless of party affiliation. Do you expect that elections will impact support for Israel? And how do we continue to ensure that aid is delivered while partisan fighting plays out in the House and the Senate?
Well, I'll go back to my ambassador point. I think we need to roll up our sleeves and make sure it doesn't happen. You know, we don't know who the runner, who's going to run. Let's assume it's President Biden, whoever on the Republican side that's left on stage. For the most part, is Israel supportive? You know, I know Nikki very well, obviously, from what I don't know DeSantis well, but from what I've seen, he's a great Israel supporter. I think Vivek has some out-of-the-box theories, so I put a question mark over his head. I don't know enough about Chris Christie on Israel, but I think that we're in pretty good shape, at least in terms of the potential Oval Office occupant, but we shouldn't take anything for granted, and we need to raise our voices and make our desires and requests very well known across the board. And that, of course, is true in Congress as well. If we aren't speaking, if we don't have rallies like we did yesterday, if people just sort of take the lazy approach and hope that other people are doing it, we're asking for a whole heap of trouble. So I think the only way to properly handle your very valid question is to roll up our sleeves, and not just, you know, this group of people and all the other organizations, but the apathy among the let's call it the I don't want to get into labels, but until October 7, there was sort of an apathy of, oh, things are working, no problem. I think since October 7, that's changed dramatically. There were so many people who weren't actively involved with respect to Israel who are saying, wow, I didn't know that. Let me get involved. Let's just keep encouraging everybody to get involved. We could disagree with Israel's policies on certain things. We may or may not agree with Bibi Netanyahu. None of that matters as much as preserving and strengthening the relationship between the US administration and Congress and Israel. And there's no substitute for activism on behalf of Israel from all of us.
Jason, it's a perfect note on which to end this very valuable conversation. We are tremendously active, and our members across this country and our friends overseas, including our 14 international offices, have been working really 24/7 on this issue, pursuing exactly what you're describing, the necessity of maintaining support for the democratic ally in the Middle East that the United States has long enjoyed, for the security of Israel and for the advance of regional stability and peace. Really appreciate so much your spending the time with us and sharing your insights, your experience. Again, refer folks to Amazon to check out your book if they haven't already obtained it. And again, want to thank you for your consistent openness to AJC, your candor and your insights that you've just offered. Daniel?
Thank you. And on behalf of American Jewish Committee and Visions of Abraham, Jason, I'd like to thank you both for taking part in today's webinar. And thank you to our global audience for tuning in. To stay up to date on the evolving situation, please make sure to follow AJC on social media at AJC Global. And you can also follow Visions of Abraham on X or elsewhere at Visions of Abraham. Our hearts are in Israel today and every day. I'm Israel-Hamas. Thank you again so much for being with us, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.